Five Nights at Freddy's is a game series that should need no introduction, but for those of you not in the know, it started as a simple horror game created by a single man, Scott Cawthon, and eventually released in 2014. The game was all about haunted animatronics coming to kill the newly hired security guard of a Chuck E. Cheese-style pizzeria. The player's job is to survive, as you might have guessed by the name of the series, 5 nights under the threat of 4 increasingly more active and aggressive animatronics. Love it or hate it, since then, its immense success, mostly on the backs of YouTubers playing the games and bringing in a young, impressionable audience, has led to a number of main games and spin-offs, as well as a profitable book series full of short stories set within the series universe. While the games have ranged from groundbreaking to mediocre, it wasn't always the gameplay that brought people back so much as the extremely ambiguous series lore, which would often leave more questions than answers. People have devoted countless hours of their lives trying to figure out the entire story based on what few table scraps were left behind in each games that often filled in holes left behind by the previous games. The fact that the series wasn't released in chronological order doesn't help simplify things either. Anyway, with that primer complete, we now turn our eyes to Security Breach. Developed by Steel Wool Studios and released on December 16th, 2021, Security Breach is the newest game in the series. In this game, we no longer play as a security guard, as is most common in FNAF games, but instead, a child locked inside an enormous pizzaplex and hunted by the place's security guard and animatronics. With the help of the titular character, Freddy Fazbear, who is actually our friend this time instead of being our enemy, the player must survive several intense hours until they can find a way to escape. Though, beyond attempting to escape, there are many mysteries and secrets just waiting to be unveiled. If Steel Wool Studios sounds familiar, it's because they're the indie developers behind FNAF VR Help Wanted. It goes without saying that a game the size of Security Breach needed an entire team behind it, and not just Scott Cawthon, who up until Help Wanted did pretty much all the work on each game by himself. Though personally, I think Steel Wool may have bitten off a little bit more than they could chew on this one, which I'll explain later. The graphics in Security Breach are actually really good, faithfully capturing that sort of 80s mall aesthetic with tons of neon and arcade games. In fact, I'd say that the game's graphics and aesthetic are spectacular, besides the music. Speaking of the music, it's also extremely good, helping to lend authenticity as well as intensity to the setting. It's worth listening to the soundtrack because actually paying attention in-game can be a bit tricky at times, especially as the game moves forward and things become more and more chaotic. Beyond the aesthetics, music, and ambiance, the game's well animated, with nearly all the animatronics moving fluidly and convincingly regardless of their state. The voice acting is spectacular for a game like this, probably better than it needed to be, and the lore bits you receive from various in-game collectibles are fun to read and range from little lore blurbs to actual in-game hints. Though, frankly, I think there are too many collectibles, and a lot of them are really hidden so that they're pretty easy to miss. Unfortunately, the list of good things in Security Breach is so very, very short compared to the bad. Remember when I mentioned that Steel Wool bit off more than they could chew here? That comes primarily in the form of the game world being way too big. The scale of the game is impressive as hell for what's essentially an indie developer, but that size makes it extremely tedious to traverse the game. Adding to that, while the game looks great and has amazing aesthetics, damn near the entire game looks exactly like that, which makes many zones look the same and as a result, make it not just tedious, but also extremely confusing to walk through. I mean, look at this shit, it's just way too much. Who thought this was a good idea? Another issue I had was that for the first half of the game, the developers were pretty desperate to corral you exactly where they want you, so much so that they restrict your movement for no apparent reason. Because of this, it's very difficult to know where to go and what to do most of the time, so a lot of the game's time, actual playtime, is padded purely with confusion. For example, there's a part where you have to go from the main stage to the 3rd floor to start the show so that you can take the main stage elevator down. There's several ways to get to the 3rd floor, but they block most of the ways to get up there except for one, forcing you to take a very particular path to your destinations, which I assume was done to increase difficulty. Speaking of increasing difficulty, the game has an entire endgame segment that must be done without saving from beginning to end if you want to see everything the game has to offer, which normally isn't that bad of a prospect. FNAF as a series is no stranger to locking content and lore behind some Herculean effort, but a single mess up means you've lost whatever effort you've put in. It's extremely frustrating since you basically can't 100% the game without acquiring the collectibles you couldn't get from newly accessible areas. Yet, you can't save your progress at all, which was an awful idea for what essentially amounts to a horror collectathon game. The lack of foresight here is incredibly impressive, but also very frustrating, and I hope they change that in the near future. Also, the animatronic AI is extremely poor. The security bots that overwhelm the pizzaplex have purposely preset pathing so they're predictable and easy to avoid, but the main animatronics do extremely annoying things like teleport behind or in front of you for no real reason. Sometimes, when they chase you, they'll either chase you to the ends of the earth or will lose you the moment you break line of sight. There is no in-between here. This means making mistakes is often extremely costly, and this is exacerbated later on down the line in the endgame when you can't save. I made multiple attempts and would often lose 20 plus minutes or more of progress to a single misstep. It also doesn't help that the animatronics will do things like lunge through stairs or walls to try to get at you. It's even scarier to see that happen than the jump scares that often follow. Another thing I wish I'd captured was the way the game loads things. There were often instances where I'd go to the main stage area and the entire section would take several seconds to load completely and properly, which left me staring at normally unseeable security robots and animatronics wandering around in the distance until everything finally loaded in. Worse than that was the game stuttering. The way the game loads everything as you approach what I assume is some sort of transition zone causes the game to stutter frequently, which you'll no doubt see with the footage I've taken here. That doesn't seem to be something unique to my actually decent computer. I've seen streams and YouTube videos with gameplay footage that have the exact same problem as me. It's really bad in some places. Last, but certainly not least, the game ends fairly abruptly, or I should say it segs into the endgame fairly abruptly. I've never once gotten whiplash from a game before, but with how suddenly the game chose to present the end to me, I was absolutely baffled. It feels like they had a story made and changed their minds on things halfway through or something. It's tough to really put into words. Similarly, the endings are, quite honestly, boring at best and anticlimactic at worst. They do answer some lore questions and fill in a few plot holes, but that doesn't make them any less disappointing. They felt more like an afterthought, and even the ones that don't immediately seem that way aren't really that great either. A ton of build-up and teasing, but with a poor delivery. Here's hoping the inevitable DLC isn't as poorly planned and executed as this entire game is. Having said all that, there are a lot of places where Security Breach does shine, but a few glittering gems in a mall-sized turd does not a good game make. The great news is that many of the game's problems can be solved by looking into improving animatronic AI and overall game and graphical optimization. Granted, it won't solve every problem, and I don't expect they'll ever try to make the game flow better or make the first half of the game more diverse and less tedious, but what they have there, what they could work on, that's a pretty good start. Should really just give us the requisite FNAF trademark office defense minigame, and then call it a wrap on Security Breach, take everything they learned into the inevitable sequel. As of this video, Security Breach is currently $40, but I can't really recommend it for that much. Maybe wait for a sale, snag it at $20. Until some major fixes and optimizations drop, it's tough to recommend it for anything more than that. The game doesn't really feel like it's worth the current price tag. Thanks for hanging out today. If you want more Chunky Beef, be sure to drop a like and subscribe to us. We've also got a Twitter account where we post about new content, link in the description below. See you soon.